All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're unpacking an absolutely wild intelligence briefing known as Operation Omega Protocol. This explainer is basically a masterclass in systemic stress testing. It models a total global supply chain cascade that gets triggered by this massive convergence of physical warfare, energy grid failures, and, perhaps the most terrifying part, a completely tapped-out consumer base. So we're going to walk through exactly how this scenario unfolds, domino by domino, using the direct telemetry straight from the source models.
Now, to really grasp the sheer urgency of this briefing, you've got to look at the timeline. The models here, they're zeroing in on a highly specific, terrifyingly tight window. We are exactly T-minus 8.5 hours away from a massive geopolitical pivot point. The countdown is literally locked. In this scenario, all your traditional interagency processes, the State Department, standard diplomatic channels, they are completely severed. We are operating in those final, eerie moments of what the general public thinks is just unpanicked normalcy.
So what does that actually mean? Well, the briefing calls this 8.5-hour threshold the executive override. What happens here is a total information blackout. I mean, the DC vacuum is absolute. Standard leaks to the press drop straight to zero, and the major algorithmic news desks, they sense this vacuum instantly. They place their primary anchors in reserve, start cycling through filler content, and essentially get stuck in a holding pattern waiting for a 1300 Eastern Time vice presidential override. If you are outside the SIFE, the sensitive compartmented information facility, you are flying entirely blind.
And that override, it kicks off our very first massive domino. Section 1, the global diesel snap, triggering a macro system fracture.
Right, so the spark for all of this is a physical kinetic strike right in the Persian Gulf that completely shuts down the Strait of Hormuz. Boom. The immediate kinetic impact sends Brent crude oil surging way past $150 a barrel. Now, normally, the Federal Reserve would just raise interest rates to fight this kind of oil-driven inflation, right? But the briefing points out a fatal flaw here. The Fed is totally trapped against a $40 trillion debt wall. They physically cannot raise rates high enough without the interest payments bankrupting the U.S. government itself. So inflation instantly doubles and the U.S. dollar just starts hemorrhaging its domestic purchasing power.
Now you might be wondering, why does an oil spike literally break the entire supply chain so violently? Honestly, it just comes down to chemistry. We're looking at a physical unavailability of distillate fuel oil. See, refineries that are optimized to produce huge yields of diesel strictly require medium sour crude oil from the Middle East. Actually, scratch that. You literally cannot substitute this vital chemical feedstock with a light, sweet crude we pump out of U.S. shale fields. It doesn't work. And to make matters worse, jet fuel and diesel are cut from the exact same crude fraction. So commercial and military aviation immediately start cannibalizing the diesel supply just to keep planes in the air. It's a massive structural shortage.
And look, rationing isn't just some abstract theory we're talking about here. In this model's Eastern Hemisphere, it is happening right now. Just look at the global rationing telemetry data. Over in India, where trucks move about 70% of their cargo, physical rationing is already hitting the terminals. Australia? They're basically a glass cannon with almost zero domestic refining capacity, and they're staring down a terrifying 22-day supply. Meanwhile, China flips the switch on command and control protocols, aggressively hoarding an estimated 1.4 billion barrel strategic reserve, but strictly for military and heavy industrial use.
So how exactly does the West handle a crisis like this? Well, through something the briefing calls silent rationing. Because, think about it, Western governments won't issue physical ration cards. That would trigger immediate panic buying, right? So instead, they just let wholesale diesel prices spike to over $1,400 per ton. By letting fuel become completely, absurdly unaffordable, they execute demand destruction. Fuel gets effectively rationed to the massive corporate logistics networks and the military, while everyone else just gets priced out.
Okay, let's track this as it cascades down to our regional logistics networks. Section 2, the supply chain fracture and the resulting trucking purge. The intelligence gathered here from dispatch boards and trucker chatter highlights a stark, honestly disturbing contrast. Independent owner-operators, the actual backbone of the American supply chain, are getting hit with a 30 to 40% surge in operating costs right as spot freight rates collapse. They are mathematically bleeding out. It's triggering this massive wave of voluntary repossession where drivers are literally just mailing their keys back to the banks. Meanwhile, the corporate mega carriers, they're just absorbing all that remaining market share, perfectly positioning themselves to be quietly nationalized so the government can prioritize military logistics over civilian food distribution.
To kind of bring this abstract data down to earth, the briefing models what it calls the I-5 logistics severance out on the West Coast. Because maintaining those separate fuel-hungry diesel units for refrigerated trailers, the reefers, is completely bankrupting the independents,
The spot market for moving perishable food collapses entirely. The models are projecting that major supermarket chains, places like Safeway, Fred Meyer, and Walmart, will experience rolling stockouts within 14 days of the initial strike.
And that brings us to the final fatal collision. Section 3, the consumer credit collapse. Basically, the end of the line for the tapped-out consumer.
I've got to tell you, the social intelligence telemetry in this report gets incredibly dark. I'm just going to read this quote directly from the source because it hits the nail on the head regarding the severity of all this. The middle class is using high-interest, unsecured debt as a biological life support mechanism just to afford base calories.
And the baseline financial reality backing that up? The average credit card interest rate has officially breached 22%. That civilian financial buffer we always rely on? Completely gone. Consumers aren't financing luxury goods anymore. They are literally rolling grocery debt into minimum payments that they can't even afford. The digital sentiment sweeping across personal finance forums has shifted so rapidly from frustration straight into pure despair. The specific data points are honestly staggering. We're talking about a 400% spike in people using buy now, pay later apps, not for big ticket items, but for their weekly grocery runs. People are intentionally defaulting on their auto loans just to keep their credit cards active so they can eat. So the crucial takeaway here is this. When those corporate mega carriers inevitably pass the massive new diesel fuel surcharges onto the grocery stores, the cost of bread and milk is going to gap up overnight. These maxed out consumers are going to hit a literal physical wall where the digital ledger just rejects them.
Knowing this exact cascade is hitting in a matter of hours, the briefing immediately shifts gears. Section 4, Vanguard Tactical Execution. This is the zero-hour plan to survive a projected 90-day systemic severance.
So, inside that final 8.5-hour window, the pre-dawn telemetry is just a flurry of massive silent movements. On the surface, the information space is totally quiet, right? But underneath, the physical space is moving at absolute maximum velocity. Asian and early European markets show institutional capital aggressively fleeing straight into physical gold and U.S. treasuries. Commercial heavy freight carriers like FedEx and UPS start executing ghost reroutes, eating higher fuel costs just to completely avoid Arabian Peninsula airspace. And by 0800 Eastern, U.S. carrier strike groups are locked in their final patrol boxes, weapons elevators secured, just waiting for the override. This part is brilliant because it shows how a massive global war game actually translates into super local actionable steps. The execution matrix gives 4 immediate actions. Step 1, hard disconnect non-essential internet to protect your networks against severe zero-day cyber attacks. Step 2, physically lock down and treat bulk diesel reserves. You treat that stuff like liquid gold. Step 3, secure all vital maintenance pharmaceuticals. They specifically cite meds like Creon and Reglan and get them inside temperature-controlled zones because the just-in-time pharmacy network is going to freeze completely. Step 4, finalize your transactions and convert any at-risk fiat currency into physical tools and commodities before the dollar totally loses its purchasing power.
Now, the briefing constantly hammers home one massive takeaway regarding regional operating areas. Localized isolation is your absolute greatest asset, but it's also your primary vulnerability. When the central municipal grid goes down and becomes totally unreliable, a community's survival depends entirely on its own microgrid independence. We're talking about localized solar arrays, solid battery banks, and stabilized diesel reserves. Those things become your sole guarantee for maintaining temperature control, keeping medical supplies refrigerated, and holding perimeter security.
Operation Omega Protocol really forces us to look in the mirror, doesn't it? It strips away this whole illusion we have of infinite inventory, and it exposes the hardcore physical realities of energy and logistics. So I want to leave you with this final, genuinely provocative question straight from the briefing to chew on. When the global supply chain severs, when diesel disappears and the digital ledger fails, how resilient is your 90-day biological life support? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning and stay focused out there.